still Saturday. It's the 31st of July, and I am reading Life in the World Unseen. I have finished the first part of this book, which is called Beyond This Life, and I have now been reading part 2, The World Unseen, and I've just finished chapter 9, which was called Spirit Personalia. And now the next page, which I'm really wanting to read, is called The Children's Sphere, page 148. The Children's Sphere, chapter 10. One of the innumerable questions that I put to Edwin shortly after my arrival in the spirit world concerned the destiny of children who, as such, passed into the spirit lands. There is a period of our earthly lives which are accustomed to be called the prime of life. There's also a prime of life here in spirit, and it is towards that period that all souls either advance or return, according to the age at which their transition takes place. How long it will take rests entirely with themselves, since it is purely a matter of spiritual progression and development, through which, though with the young this period is usually much shorter. Those who pass into the spirit after the prime of life period has been reached, whether they be elderly or extremely aged, will in due time become younger in appearance, although they will grow older in knowledge and spirituality. It must not be assumed from this that we all eventually reach a dead level of commonplace uniformity. Outwardly, we look young. We lose those signs of the passage of years which cause some of us no little disturbance of mind when we are incarnate. But our minds become older as we gain knowledge and wisdom and greater spirituality, and these qualities of the mind are manifest to all with whom we come into contact. When we visited the temple in the city and from a distance beheld the radiant visitor whom we had come to honor, he presented to the eye the appearance of perfect and eternal youth. Yet the degree of knowledge and wisdom and spirituality which he diffused and which we could feel with our minds was almost overpoweringly great. It is the same in varying degrees with all those who visit us from the higher realms. If, therefore, there is this rejuvenation of fully grown people, what of the souls who pass over as children? Indeed, what of those even who pass into the spirit world at birth, or even before? The answer is that they grow as they would have grown upon the earth plane, but the children here, of all ages, are given such treatment and care as would never be possible in the earth world. The young child whose mind is not yet fully formed is uncontaminated by earthly contacts, and on passing into the spirit world it finds itself in a realm of great beauty, presided over by souls of equal beauty. The children's realm has been called the nursery of heaven, and surely anyone who has been fortunate enough to have visited it will say that a more apposite term could not be found. It was therefore, or appropriate we would say, could not be found. It was therefore in response to my original question that Edwin proposed that Ruth and I should accompany him on a visit to the nursery of heaven. We walked towards the boundary between the higher realm and our own, and we turned in the direction of Edwin's house. Already we could feel the atmosphere more rarefied, though it was not sufficiently pronounced to cause us any inconvenience or discomfort. I noticed that this atmosphere had a great deal more colour in it, much more than in the depth of the realm. It was as though a great number of shafts of light were meeting and spreading their broad beams over all the landscapes. The shafts of light were forever on the move, interweaving themselves and producing the most delicate and delightful blending of colours, like a succession of rainbows. They were extremely restful, but they were also filled with vitality, and, it seemed to Ruth and me, light-heartedness and merriment. Sadness and unhappiness, one felt, would be utterly impossible here. The countryside took upon itself a much brighter green in its verdure. The trees were not so tall, but they were so shapely as every other tree in the realm, and they were growing as perfectly. After we proceeded a little distance, the atmosphere became clear of the coloured beams, and it more resembled that of our own sphere. But there was a strange and subtle difference, which was puzzling to the visitor on his first visit, and arose, so Edmund told us, from the essential spirituality of the children who live here. Something akin to this is to be encountered when one is privileged to journey to a higher realm than that in which one normally resides. It is almost as though there were a greater degree of buoyancy in the air, apart altogether from a noticeably effect of elevation of the mind. We saw many fine buildings before us as we walked along the soft grass. They were not of any great height, but they were broad in extent, and they were all most pleasantly situated among trees and gardens. Flowers, needless to say, were growing prolifically everywhere, in artistically arranged beds, as well as in large masses upon the grassy slopes and beneath the trees. I noticed that in some instances flowers that have their counterpart upon the earth plane were growing by themselves. Those that were proper to the spirit would be separate from them. We were told that there was no special significance in this segregation, but that it was done solely to show the distinction between the two classes of flowers, the spirit and the earthly. Beautiful as the earthly flowers are that grow here, there can be no comparison with those that belong alone to the spirit lands. Here again one is limited by earthly experience in any attempt to describe them. Not only are the colourings richer, but the conformations of the flowers and foliage present such an abundance of unparalleled beauty of design that we have no earthly example to adduce by way of comparison. But it must not be supposed that these magnificent flowers remotely suggested the rare hothouse bloom. Far from it. The superabundance of them, together with the great strength and variety of their perfumes, could instantly dispel any thought of rarity. It was no case of cultivating the beauty of the bloom at the expense of its perfume. They all possessed the quality common to all growing things here, that of pouring out energizing force, not only through the medium of their aromas, but through personal contact. I had already tried the experiments of holding a flower with the cupped hands. It was Ruth who had instructed me, and I had felt the stream of life force flowing up my arms. We could see the delightful ponds and small lakes, upon the surface of which were flourishing the most beautiful water flowers in the gayest colours. In another direction we could see larger expanses of water, like a series of lakes with many small boats gliding serenely along. The buildings were constructed of a substance that had all the appearance of alabaster, and they were all tinged with the most delicate colours, such as one is accustomed to seeing in the subtle blendings of an earthly rainbow. The style of architecture resembled for the most part that of our own sphere. That is to say, some of the buildings bore upon their surface the most exquisite carvings of such natural objects as abound in the trees and flowers, while others drew for their relief upon the normal features particular to the spirit world. But what gave us the most enjoyable surprise was to see, interspersed throughout the woods, the quaintest little cottages, such as one was always inclined to believe one belonged to the pages of children's storybooks. Here were diminutive houses with crooked timbers, beautifully crooked, with bright red roofs and lattice windows, and each with a charming little garden all its own surrounding it. It will at once be concluded that the spirit world has borrowed from the earth world in these fanciful recreations for the children's delight, but such is not the case. In truth, this whole conception of miniature houses emanated, in the first instance, from the spirit world. Whoever was the artist who received our original impression, she has been lost to the earth world through the course of the years. That artist is known to us here, though, where she continues her work in the children's sphere. These little houses were large enough to allow a grown person plenty of room in which to move without appearing to knock his head. To the children, they seemed to be just of the right size, without their feeling lost in them. I learned that it was for this same reason that all the large buildings in this realm were without any appreciable height. By thus not making them too high, nor the rooms too large, they conformed with a child's mind, as yet not fully formed, where spaces seem greater than they really are, and where buildings too spacious would have the effect upon a little mind of seeming to dwarf it. Great numbers of children live in these tiny dwellings, each being presided over by an older child who is perfectly capable of attending to any situation that might arise with the other residents. As we walked along, we could see groups of happy children, some playing games with their fellows, others seated upon the grass while a teacher was reading to them. Others again were to be observed listening attentively and with marked interest to a teacher who was explaining the flowers to them and giving them something of a lesson in bounty. But it was botany of a very different order from that of the earth plane, and so far as the purely spirit flowers were concerned. The distinction between the earthly flowers and the spirit flowers were amply demonstrated by the two orders of flowers being separated. Edwin took us to one of the teachers and explained the reason of our visit. We were instantly made welcome, and the teacher was kind enough to answer a few questions. Her enthusiasm for her work added to her pleasure, she said, in telling us anything we wished to know. As to herself, she had been in the spirit world a goodly number of years. She had had children of her own when upon the earth plane, and she was still keenly interested in their welfare, and that had led her to take on her present work. So much she told us of herself. It was not very informative, and we knew as much without her having to tell us. What she did not tell us, it was Edwin who later gave us the details, was that she had made such a success with her own children upon earth, who now joined their mother in her work, that it had been obvious from the commencement just what her work would be in spirit world. Needless to say, it was the very work upon which she had set her heart, the care of children. I will stop this chapter here on page 152, and I will continue tomorrow.